In the year 1943, the small town of Millbrook seemed far from the chaos of the world. It was a peaceful place with quiet streets and friendly neighbors. Children played in the fields after school, and adults went about their daily routines as if the war was happening on a different planet. There were no soldiers marching through the town, no bombs falling from the sky. Only the distant sound of the radio occasionally reminded people that their country was at war. For Tom, a 15-year-old boy, life was simple. Every day after school, he would hop on his old bicycle and ride around town. He knew every corner, every tree, and every shop. But what he found most interesting was the town square, where he often saw Madison, the most beautiful woman in Millbrook. Madison was different from everyone else in town. She had long, dark hair that flowed like a river, and her eyes sparkled even on the cloudiest days. She always wore elegant dresses, and when she walked, it seemed like time slowed down. People would stop and stare, not just because of her beauty, but because of the mystery that surrounded her. Madison had moved to Millbrook a few years ago with her husband, James. He was a soldier, and not long after they settled in, James was sent off to fight in the war. Since then, Madison had been alone. She rarely spoke to anyone, and though people often talked about her, she remained a quiet figure, like a statue in a park that everyone notices but no one approaches. Tom had heard the rumors. The women in town said she was too pretty for her own good, and some of the men whispered that she was waiting for something. But Tom didn't care about the gossip. He was fascinated by her for reasons he didn't fully understand. Every day, he would see her sitting on a bench in the square, reading a book or just staring off into the distance. She looked lonely, but there was something strong about her too, something that made Tom want to learn more. One sunny afternoon after school, Tom rode his bike through the town square as usual. He saw Madison sitting there, her face calm, her eyes watching the clouds drift by. The sun hit her hair just right, making it shine like gold. Tom slowed down and watched her for a moment, but he didn't dare approach. She was like a star in the sky, beautiful and distant, always out of reach. As he pedaled away, he wondered what her life must be like. He knew her husband was far away, fighting in a war that seemed both important and very far from his own life. Tom couldn't imagine what it must feel like to be alone, waiting for someone who might never come back. And yet, every day, Madison came to the square, dressed as if she were waiting for a special occasion, even though nothing ever seemed to happen. The town had grown used to Madison's presence. She was always there, like a part of the scenery. But for Tom, she was more than that. She was a mystery, and he wanted to solve it. From that day on, Tom couldn't stop thinking about Madison. She was like a puzzle he wanted to solve, a secret he wanted to uncover. Every afternoon after school, he would ride his bike to the town square, pretending to be busy, but his eyes were always searching for her. And there she was, sitting quietly on her favorite bench, looking as if the world around her didn't matter. Madison never seemed to notice the people who walked by. Some women would glance at her and whisper to each other, their voices full of jealousy. "She's too beautiful for her own good," one of them would say. "I wonder who she's waiting for," another would add. They didn't understand her, and maybe they didn't want to. In their eyes, Madison's beauty made her different, and being different in a small town wasn't easy. Tom didn't care about what they said. To him, Madison wasn't just the pretty woman everyone gossiped about. He saw something else, something deeper. She looked lonely, as if the world had forgotten her. Every day, she sat there alone, waiting for someone who might never come back. Tom felt a strange connection to her, even though they had never spoken a word to each other. He knew what it was like to feel invisible, to be just another face in the crowd. Tom's friends didn't understand his fascination. They would tease him about it, making jokes whenever they saw her. "Hey, Tom, there's your girlfriend," they would shout, laughing as they nudged him. Tom would blush and shake his head, pretending it didn't bother him, but deep down, he felt a sense of admiration for Madison, something his friends couldn't understand. To Tom, Madison was more than just a beautiful face. She was a mystery, and mysteries always made him curious. He began to imagine what her life was like, alone in that big, empty house at the edge of town. He wondered what she thought about, sitting on that bench every day, watching the clouds and the people who passed by. Did she miss her husband? Did she have friends? Did she feel as lonely as she looked? Sometimes, when Tom was alone in his room, he would daydream about talking to her. He imagined walking up to her and saying something clever, something that would make her smile. In his mind, they would sit together and talk for hours. She would tell him stories about her life, and he would listen, fascinated by every word. He imagined that she had a soft, gentle voice, the kind of voice that could calm your heart. But every time Tom thought about actually approaching her, he lost his nerve. He was just a boy, and she was a grown woman, so elegant, so perfect. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound silly or awkward? And what if she didn't want to talk? What if she preferred to be alone? Still, the thought of Madison never left his mind. He would lie awake at night, thinking about her, wondering if she ever noticed him watching from across the square. He wondered if she ever felt the same way he did, like there was a whole world inside her that no one else could see. As the days passed, Tom's curiosity only grew. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't just keep watching from a distance. He had to find a way to talk to her, to understand the sadness behind her eyes. Maybe, he thought, if he could make her smile, she wouldn't feel so alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't feel so alone either. As the summer days passed, the whispers in the town of Millbrook grew louder and more frequent. What had once been small, quiet remarks about Madison now turned into full-blown rumors. The women in town seemed to enjoy talking about her, each new story more shocking than the last. "She's seeing other men while her husband is away," one woman would say, in the grocery store. "I saw her talking to Mr. Davis the other day. What would her poor husband think?" Another would nod, adding, "I bet she's not as innocent as she looks. No woman that beautiful can be. She's hiding something, I'm sure of it." These rumors spread quickly, and soon enough, everyone in town had something to say about Madison. Even people who had never spoken to her seemed to have an opinion. Some claimed she was involved with multiple men. Others said she was secretly planning to leave Millbrook. The more they talked, the less they remembered who Madison really was, a woman waiting for her husband to come home from war. Tom couldn't understand it. Why were people so cruel to her? Why did they make up lies about someone they barely knew? To him, Madison had always seemed quiet and sad, not someone looking for trouble. He had never seen her with any other men, and even if he had, what right did anyone have to judge her? She was just trying to get through a difficult time, just like everyone else. One afternoon, Tom was sitting in the town square, pretending to read a book, but his mind was elsewhere. Across the square, Madison sat alone, her face expressionless as she watched the clouds. Two women walked by, glancing at her and whispering under their breath. Tom felt a surge of anger rise inside him. He didn't know what they had said, but he could tell by the way they laughed that it wasn't kind. He wanted to go over to Madison and tell her that none of it mattered, that she shouldn't listen to what people were saying, but he didn't have the courage. She looked so distant, so unreachable. Instead, he just sat there, watching, feeling helpless. Later that evening, Tom overheard his parents talking in the kitchen. His mother was washing dishes, her voice low but sharp. "I don't know why she stays in this town. It's not right for a woman to be all alone like that, especially when her husband is off at war. People are going to talk, and you know how that ends." His father shrugged. "It's not our business. Let the woman live her life." Tom listened quietly from the hallway. It surprised him to hear his own mother talk like this. She had always been kind, but even she was getting pulled into the gossip. It seemed like no one was immune to the rumors. That night, as Tom lay in bed, he made a decision. He couldn't just sit back and let people tear Madison apart. He knew the truth. She wasn't the person they were making her out to be. She was just lonely, waiting for her husband, trying to survive the best she could. Tom decided that he had to help her somehow. But how? What could a 15-year-old boy possibly do? He couldn't stop the rumors, and he couldn't make people see her the way he did. But maybe he could reach out to her, show her that not everyone believed the lies. Maybe, if he was brave enough, he could give her a friend, someone who saw her for who she really was. One Saturday afternoon, Tom was riding his bike through the town square, like he always did. The sun was warm, and the square was busy with people going about their day. As he passed the small grocery store, he saw Madison coming out with a large brown bag in her arms. The bag looked heavy, and she was struggling to balance it. Without thinking, Tom quickly got off his bike and ran over to help her. "Let me carry that for you," he offered, his voice filled with nervous excitement. Madison looked surprised. She hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Thank you, Tom," she said softly, handing him the bag. It was heavier than it looked, and Tom had to shift his grip to keep it from slipping. Together, they walked down the street toward Madison's house, a few blocks away. At first, they didn't say much. Tom was too nervous to speak, and Madison seemed cautious, as if she wasn't sure what to say either. The weight of the rumors hung in the air between them, but Tom tried to ignore it. All he wanted was to help her, to show her that someone in this town cared about her, not the gossip. Finally, as they turned onto her street, Madison broke the silence. "You're very kind to help me," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "Most people just pass by." Tom glanced over at her, surprised by the sadness in her voice. "It's nothing," he said quickly. "I see you in the square a lot, and I wanted to say hello before, but I didn't know how." Madison smiled a little, but it was a sad smile. "People don't usually talk to me," she said, looking down at the ground. "They're afraid of what others might say." Tom felt a surge of anger at how unfair it all was. "I don't care what people say," he blurted out. "They don't know you. They don't know anything." Madison stopped walking and looked at him, her eyes soft but full of pain. "Thank you, Tom," she said after a pause. "That means more than you know." They continued walking in silence, but the air between them felt different now, lighter, as if something had shifted. When they reached Madison's house, Tom helped her carry the groceries inside. Her house was small and neat, with a few pictures on the walls and a quiet, almost lonely atmosphere. As he set the bag down on the kitchen table, he noticed a framed photo of Madison and her husband James in uniform, smiling together. It was a simple picture, but the love between them was clear. Tom wanted to ask about James, but he didn't want to seem nosy. Instead, he said, "If you ever need help again, you can always ask me. I'm happy to help." Madison smiled again, this time a little brighter. "I'll remember that," she said. "Thank you, Tom. You're very kind." After that day, Tom and Madison's paths began to cross more often. Sometimes he would see her at the grocery store or in the square, and they would chat for a few minutes. The conversations were always simple, about the weather, the town, or something Tom had seen at school, but they were enough to break the loneliness that seemed to follow Madison everywhere. Over time, Tom learned more about her. She told him stories about her life before the war, how she and James had met in a city far from Millbrook, how they had moved here to start a quiet life together. She spoke of James with such love in her voice, and Tom could see how much she missed him. It wasn't just loneliness she felt. It was a deep, aching sadness that came from not knowing if he would ever return. Madison, in turn, seemed to enjoy Tom's company. She smiled more often when they talked, and Tom could see the tension in her shoulders relax just a little. She was still cautious, though. She didn't want people to think too much of their friendship, so they kept their conversations short and in public places, always careful not to attract attention. Despite the rumors, Madison was nothing like the woman people imagined her to be. She wasn't looking for attention or trouble. She was just trying to live her life, waiting for her husband to come home, hoping that one day the war would end and they could be together again. As the weeks passed, Tom realized how much he had grown to care for Madison, not in the way the rumors suggested, but as a friend, someone he wanted to protect. He understood now that beauty wasn't just about looks. Madison was beautiful because she was strong, because she kept going even when the world seemed to be against her. Their friendship was an unexpected one, but it was real. And for Tom, that was enough. The war finally came to an end, and Millbrook began to breathe again. The town square, once quiet and full of uncertainty, was now busy with people celebrating the return of their loved ones. Flags were hung, and soldiers returned home, greeted with tears of joy and relief. But for Madison, the ending was different. She had waited for months, hoping for news of her husband James. But as more and more soldiers returned, and James did not, Madison began to understand the truth. One day, a letter arrived, a formal note from the army informing her that James had died in the line of duty. There was no explanation, just a brief statement that left Madison with the finality she had been dreading. Tom heard the news from his mother, who had heard it from a neighbor. The whole town seemed to know about it within hours. Some people whispered their sympathy, while others didn't say much, as if the loss of James was just another event in a town filled with war stories. But for Tom, it was personal. He couldn't stop thinking about Madison and what she must be going through. He rode his bike past her house that afternoon, hoping to see her. But she wasn't outside. The curtains were drawn, and the house looked still, as if frozen in time. Tom didn't know what to do. Should he go in? Should he try to comfort her? But what could he say to ease the pain of losing someone so important? A few days later, he saw Madison again, sitting on the same bench in a square where they had first spoken. She looked different now. Her face was still beautiful, but her eyes seemed heavier, weighed down by sadness. She wasn't reading a book this time or watching the clouds. She was just sitting there as if waiting for something that would never come. Tom walked over and sat beside her, not saying anything at first. The silence between them felt thick, but not uncomfortable. After a while, Madison spoke softly, her voice calm but distant. "I got the letter," she said, her hands resting in her lap. "James isn't coming back." Tom didn't know how to respond. He wanted to say something comforting, something that would make the pain go away, but he knew there were no words that could fix this. So instead, he just nodded. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Madison smiled, but it was a sad, weary smile. "It's strange," she said, her voice steady. "I waited so long for him, and now that I know he's gone, I don't feel anything. I guess I already knew, deep down. I've known for a while." Tom looked at her, seeing the strength behind her words. She wasn't falling apart like people in town might have expected. She wasn't giving up. Madison had always been strong, and now, even in the face of her greatest loss, she was still holding on. "What will you do now?" Tom asked, unsure of what she might say. Madison looked around the square, at the people moving on with their lives. "I don't know," she admitted. "I think it's time for me to leave this place. There's nothing for me here anymore. I need a fresh start, somewhere where people don't know me, where I can just be me." Tom felt a pang of sadness at the thought of Madison leaving. Over the months, she had become an important part of his life. Even if they didn't see each other often, she had taught him so much about kindness, about strength, and about how appearances can be deceiving. The thought of never seeing her again was hard to accept, but he knew it was the right decision for her. This town had never been kind to Madison. It had never understood her, and it never would. She needed a place where she could start over, free from the gossip and judgment. "I'll miss you," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. Madison turned to him, her eyes softening. "I'll miss you too, Tom," she said. "You've been a good friend to me, and I'm grateful for that. You're a kind soul, and I know you'll do great things someday." They sat there for a while longer, neither of them saying much, just watching the town go about its day. When Madison finally stood up to leave, Tom felt a deep sense of loss, but also a quiet sense of understanding. This was how it had to be. Madison left Millbrook a few days later. There was no grand farewell, no big goodbye. She packed her things, sold her house, and quietly slipped away. Most people in town barely noticed her departure, but Tom did. He watched as her car disappeared down the road, knowing that it was the last time he would see her. Years later, Tom would often think back on Madison. He would remember her, not just for her beauty, but for her strength, her courage, and her kindness. The town had judged her by her looks, but Tom had seen the truth. Madison was more than just a beautiful face. She was a fighter, someone who had endured great pain and loss, but had never let it break her. In his heart, Tom would always carry the memory of Madison. She had changed him, helped him grow, and made him see the world differently. And for that, he would be forever grateful.